This video is a complement to your reading for this week from the Hypertext Book of Hours, and I hope that it'll help you put this text into its historical, spiritual, and of course material context. It's part of our religion and myth unit because this is another way that the saint stories we've been talking about were circulated in the later Middle Ages. It's also going to help you make sense of the significance of some of the things that you've seen in special collections during your manuscript handling sessions. What this type of book really does is help us to understand some of the ways that saint stories and other parts of the spiritual worldviews that we've been talking about could be integrated into the lives of individual people. I want to demonstrate the close connections that readers could have with these stories through the kinds of interactions they had with the material objects that contained them. Along the way, as we move through the content of these books, there are some key topics that are going to surface, so pay attention to these as you watch. First, lay piety. This is a bit of a hairy term, but suffice to say, when we're talking about books of hours, we're mostly talking about the religious practices of people who were not clerics. Next, the cult of the Virgin. This refers to the rituals and ceremonies surrounding the Virgin Mary. The Mother of Christ is the star of the Book of Hours and a really important figure in the expression of lay piety in the later Middle Ages because she had such strong intercessory capabilities and was also very relatable. And on the screen is an image from a French Book of Hours that shows these two first themes in action. On the left, the Virgin and Child, and on the right, we have the owners or patrons of the manuscript who kneel in front of her praying. Penance and purgatory. Penance is repentance and punishment for sin, and purgatory is a place of limbo where you were believed to go after death to be purified before you could enter heaven. It's very much like hell with all of its associated horrors, but the key difference is that it ends. So it's a place for the short-term punishment of sins. Now, unfortunately, short-term could be 20,000 years or so, so you want the prayers of the living to help you move from purgatory to heaven in the shortest period possible. And finally, the performance of both piety and wealth. These books are spiritual tools, but they could also be used as vehicles for displaying wealth and status. These were very personal items that show a high degree of customization around the standard text that you'll be reading. This list and a few other key terms will be linked below as a handout and posted in course spaces. So as I've mentioned, we're just going to look at one genre of manuscript in this video. But if you're just going to look at one kind of book, the Book of Hours is a really good one to start with because there are just so many of them. They were, as Roger Wyke has called them, the bestsellers of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So between the mid-13th and mid-16th centuries, you have more of these books being produced in Europe than anything else, including Bibles. They're also particularly interesting to look at because they're often, but by no means always, illustrated. What we're going to be looking at are rather lavish copies, but this kind of illustration is not the norm at all. So what is a Book of Hours as a text or a collection of texts and images? At the most basic level, it's a prayer book, almost always written in Latin, that centers around the so-called Little Office of the Virgin Mary, and it has a few other components that we're going to walk through eventually. One of the key features of this book, besides the focus on the Virgin, is that it contains prayers that could be said at various times during the day. So that means that this is an object that was meant to be kept close to you and consulted frequently. It could even be worn on the body as a kind of accessory to your dress. So on the screen is a print showing what's called a girdle book or a girdle binding. You can see that there's a piece of leather that continues beyond the bookboard on the top to a point with a knot at the end of it. And if you happen to be the owner of a girdle book like this, you could tuck that knot into your belt or girdle and then have easy access to your book throughout the day. It also means that even when you're not reading your book, you're displaying it to those around you. I just want to pause to say that the Book of Hours isn't the only kind of book that would be bound this way, but it was almost always used for religious texts. What differentiates the Book of Hours from other types of prayer books is that it was designed especially for lay people. It's a shortened version of a psalter, which is a kind of book that would be used to help order the spiritual lives of monks and nuns. And in the later Middle Ages, lay people wanted to have a bit of that monastic experience in their own world. This book would allow them to really take part in their own spiritual health by setting up a program of private devotion. You can see in these two images from the Book of Hours of Mary of Burgundy that Mary is using her book on the left in a way that allows her to come into direct contact with the Virgin Mary, an event that you can see taking place in the background. So we have two Marys of Burgundy in just one page, one in the foreground and one in the back, both identifiable by this pointy hat, properly called a hennin. The second page on the right shows Mary of Burgundy has left her Book of Hours open on the ledge because her meditation on the book has allowed her to jump directly into a scene of the crucifixion. That's her in the blue looking out at us, or rather, she's looking out at herself as she views her own book. So all of this is to say that the Book of Hours was intended to draw lay people into the stories of the saints, and especially the Virgin Mary. These are not just abstract stories, but words and images that you were supposed to interact with directly and ideally multiple times a day, every day. So the Hours of the Virgin or Prayers to the Virgin were the central part of this genre, but it also includes other items that were important to the spiritual lives of lay people, and I'll take you through just a few of them now. This is a really charming example of a manuscript page that can show you just how important these books could be and how integrated they were with daily life. We have here the Our Father, a very standard prayer that you'd want in your Book of Hours, but also on top there's an alphabet. Roger Wyke has argued that this particular book was made for a child and that the damage to the page could be related to the clumsy fingers of someone very young. So you can think of this type of book as a place not just to read, but also to learn to read. It's that basic and fundamental. As you will read this week, Books of Hours also include a calendar that lists important saints' days and feasts. And here's a lovely calendar page for December with a playful snowball fight at the bottom and a little symbol for the related astrological symbol for Capricorn in a cameo on the right. Calendars would be useful to their original owners, but they're also really useful to scholars who use them to determine where the manuscript was made, because the lists of saint days are based on local traditions. You'll also find in these books the 7 penitential psalms, which are a series of prayers said to have been written by King David that are expressions of sorrow over sins that have been committed. So this is a way of doing penance yourself. And you also have a series of so-called suffrages, which are usually little stories about saints and then prayers requesting aid and intercession, something you learned about in our discussion of Sainte Foy. This image shows part of the martyrdom of Saint Apollonia, who's having her teeth ripped out, and it's positioned right at the start of her suffrage in a Book of Hours. So we have this image and then her story and prayers to this particular saint. The final portion of the standard text that I'm going to talk about is the section that seems to be the most interesting to students, the Office of the Dead. And this is a series of prayers to be said in honor of the dead to help expedite their transition from purgatory to heaven. Again, this speaks to the power of these books as ritual objects, because using them properly can have a real impact on the souls of other people, perhaps deceased friends and relatives. This section often includes illustrations showing the last rites, but on the screen you can see an image of purgatory from a famous Book of Hours illustrated by the Limburg brothers for Jean, the Duke of Berry, in the early 15th century. This is a really complex image that we won't pull apart right now, but you can see angels just plucking various penitents out of the flames and carrying them upwards. Because Books of Hours are such personal books, they become places where all different kinds of content can be collected. They can act a little bit like a spiritual scrapbook for the owner. So to be clear, there's a standard program for this kind of manuscript, and that's pretty much what you'll be reading this week. But like all manuscripts, they were also highly customizable. What you're looking at right now is the back page of a 15th century book of hours made in Bruges, and you can see that several gold and silver medallions are stitched directly onto the parchment. These are pilgrim badges collected by going to various important shrines and offering a donation. And in exchange for the donation, you'd get, of course, a spiritual reward, the forgiveness of sins, but you'd also get one of these little souvenirs sometimes. And they're really just very thin pieces of metal that you were usually struck with a stamp to leave a design on them. If you look closely at the designs, you can see that the badge is another way of representing the saint stories we've been talking about. One of the clearest in this case is the second badge from the bottom on the right, which has an image of a female saint who is about to be beheaded. That doesn't narrow down her identity too much, but it could be St. Margaret or St. Barbara. It's hard to say without getting a closer look. The important point for our purposes is that this little collection is a personal record of a pilgrimage, and they connect people with the saints. There are plenty of other personal customizations that can be found in this kind of book. As you've already seen with the Mary of Burgundy, patron portraits are relatively common, and on the screen is a portrait of Jean of Berry, who we've already talked about a little bit, one of the most famous lovers of manuscripts in general, and books of hours in particular in the medieval world. He's the man with the fur cap and blue and gold robe on the right of the composition. As we've seen, in lots of ways, these books are serious spiritual tools, but the fact is that this is not just a place to contain prayers and to help you free your friends from the fires of purgatory. John of Berry had several of these books, and many say that books of hours act as his vehicle of choice for displaying wealth and status. Now, before I go too far, I should say that the Duke had many vehicles for displaying wealth and status, and these range from his 17 chateaux to his collection of gems and jewels, to the keeping of both wild and tame animals. So you can see a little hunting dog in the foreground of this scene, and he stands in for the 1,500 dogs the Duke had in 1388. And the Duke also had bears, a camel, and a monkey, among other things. But here, the markers of wealth and luxury are the beauty of the illustration, the display of the Duke's wealth around him in this image, the use of expensive pigments like lapis lazuli to get that ultramarine blue that's all over this manuscript. And at the top, this complex astrological information that marks this as part of a calendar. It's unfinished in this image, but here you'll see in the pages for February on the left and June on the right, you can see all of this sophisticated data in the half circles at the top. This is not seen in every book of hours, but it's instead related to the Duke's personal interest in astrology and astronomy and his cultural environment, where he surrounded himself with learned individuals who had this kind of knowledge. This final image is something that became relatively common in books of hours, even though it had little to do with the Virgin or the saints. It's a zodiac man image, and it helps the viewer to calculate the best times to perform bloodletting and other medical procedures according to the solar and lunar calendars that are represented on the rings around the central figure. Seems like a really strange addition to a prayer book, but it works because we know that it is something that was really important to the Duke who owned it. He was a strong believer in this kind of medicine, and we know that he had certain rules around needing to undergo phlebotomy before he would gamble and the like. So I want to leave you with the thought that these are above all personal books. The stories and prayers in them are not abstract, but tied to the daily lives of individual book users. The text you're reading for this week gives you a good sense of the genre, but every manuscript is different, and each one is going to bear traces of the people who use them, and that's really important when you're studying them.